talk is by Dr. Richard Allen, and it's entitled Joseph Tregelles Price, 1784 to 1854, A Champion of Human Rights. Now, Richard Allen is a British and transatlantic historian. He studied for a PhD in history in Aberystwyth University, and he is now currently a visiting fellow in the School of History, Classics and Archaeology at Newcastle University. This is following a career teaching at several universities, including Trinity College, Carmarthen, Northumbria University, Sunderland University, the University of South Wales, and Newcastle University. He's also worked in universities in the US and Australia. Richard is interested in the social, cultural, and religious history in Britain, America, and Australia. He's published widely, especially on radical dissent and the Quakers, and also on Joseph Tregelles Price, which is his subject tonight. And Richard lives in Abergavenny. So without further ado, I introduce Richard Allen.
Thank you very much, Carmen, for those kind words. I'm also a visiting fellow at the Australian National University at Canberra as well for my sins. And I live in Abergavenny, which is currently twinned with Atlantis,
Right.
Or at least it feels like it. I'm also grateful to Andrew and the committee for inviting me to give this paper. So if I can now share my screen.
That's okay.
Okay. Right, so you should have a big picture of Joseph Tregelles Price now, a champion of human rights. My focus for this evening is a member of the Religious Society of Friends, or more commonly known as the Quakers. Now, Quakers, as you probably are aware, are a minority faith, but even today they are widely respected and internationally recognized as a notable religious pressure group. Their belief system is synonymous with doing good service and sponsoring humanitarian causes. Now, that much we all know. And yet, the case of Joseph Tregelles Price throws up a number of issues concerning this level of identification. Price was a Quaker industrialist in a cutthroat age of industrial expansion. He was an idealist in an age of big ideas, an advocate for conflict resolution, and a spokesperson for minority rights, including the abolition of slavery. While his views can be located in the local Neath and Swansea and regional South Wales, they can also be expressed in a much wider context, for Price was also an internationalist. His humanitarian values similarly gave hope for toleration. He sought justice and truth, including the promotion of a fairer society and ultimately peaceful resolution in a century of conflict. So for the purposes of this evening, I will break the paper into 4 sections. Price, the industrialist and educator. Price, the pacifist. Price and his humanitarian activities in Wales. And then very briefly, time permitting, Price and his work to abolish slavery. So who was Joseph Tregelles Price? Joseph was born in Cornwall on the 20th of January, 1784, and was the eldest son of Peter Price, initially a corn merchant and later an industrialist. Joseph was educated at Compton boarding school in Dorset from the age of 8 until he was 14 years of age, and was by all accounts a conscientious scholar. But he was also fond of play, which is rather unquakerly. Despite these useful indulgences, he nevertheless searched for a deeper meaning and remained a committed Quaker throughout his life. After his education finished, He assisted his father in his diverse business interests, and in 1818, he became a partner at the Neath Abbey coal and iron works. In 1821, on the death of his father, he was appointed as manager, and by 1829, he was the managing director of the company. And here I have provided a few newspaper extracts to illustrate his business activities. And in the next bit of the slide, you will actually see some of his contacts. I draw your attention to the last line, or the last two lines, because it includes his contact with the Walkers of Staffordshire, and particularly George Stephenson, the railway man. Now, it has been argued that Quaker involvement in the development of Welsh industries was a romantic chapter, where many leading Quakers were enterprising individuals who sought to maximize their capital without the oppressive workplace regime. Although perhaps an oversimplification of the often fractious relationship between workers and industrialists in Wales, Price was known for his engineering prowess, diligence, and caring attitude. Under his guidance, the workers at the Neath Abbey works, quote, believed that the work of their hands under the inspection of their beloved master could not be surpassed anywhere. A later testimony also acknowledged that he won the respect and regard of the large number of persons over whom he presided, and he was ever alive to promote their moral and religious welfare. Indeed, he advocated social welfare reform, educational facilities for the working class, and an end to poverty. The striking demographic increase in South Wales, particularly in the 19th century, created a new social problem, as well as the awareness that educational provision was the best possible means of alleviating poverty and preventing unrest. For Price, education was central to the wider reform of society, as it offered opportunities for self-help and social security. At the Neath Abbey works, Price was determined to provide schooling for his workers and their children. Now, this was not the first time in South Wales that Quaker industrialists had offered such provision. In 1786, the Quaker Harford family established a school at their Melyn Griffith ironworks on the outskirts of Cardiff. And in the early 19th century, they provided a basic education for the workers' children based on Joseph Lancaster's model of British and foreign schools. The Harford family were instrumental in providing educational facilities, including a library and reading room, and in 1812, the Harfords again provided rudimentary education for their workers and their children at the Ebbw ironworks. Significantly for Neath Abbey, Peter Price, Joseph's father, had also established a school in 1802. The Cambrian newspaper offered the following assessment during an inspection of the school in May 1816, when the parents were provided with details of its purpose and its success. The schoolroom was nearly filled, and several appropriate addresses were delivered. The progress made by many of the boys was highly satisfactory. The newspaper went on to state, "The attendance of scholars has been numerous and regular since the meeting, which was most respectably attended, and we feel confident that the utility of similar schools would be considerably extended if such public appeals to the feelings and common sense of parents were more frequent. Wasn't it the same then as possibly it is today? Joseph Tregelles Price was naturally following in his father's footsteps and was helped by his two sisters, Junia and Christiana. Their motives were undoubtedly philanthropic, as they sought to inculcate Christian values among the workforce. Nevertheless, industrialists, Quaker and non-Quaker alike, had to ensure that their businesses were competitive. And to do this, they required a well-educated and technically skilled workforce. As such, Price offered his workers a basic education in the work school, as well as practical training. He was particularly concerned to retain his apprentices in the longer term, so that he could protect them from what he believed to be the destructive and immoral influences of 19th century consumer society, while at the same time ensuring the stability of his workforce. So what became of the school Price helped to establish? In the late 1840s, commissioners who were required to report on the state of education in Wales commented favourably about the Neath Abbey School. In the initial Blue Book report of 1847, the inspector, William Morris, reiterated Price's view that it had the most beneficial effect upon the working classes of the neighbourhood, who used to be notorious for their blackguardism or reprobate behaviour. In the period between the establishment of the school in 1802 and the completion of the report between 1847 and 1848, Price had invested considerable funds in providing new buildings, enlisted the support of other leading gentlemen in the area, and paid for the employment of 3 male teachers. Price was commended for introducing a weekly stoppage for the workers' Price was commended for introducing a weekly stoppage from the workers' wages to help support the school and for the general provision itself. As shown here, in the school, Price provided a raised gallery and desk for the master, parallel desks and fixed slates for the scholars, a border of blackboard running around the walls for writing or drawing. There were nevertheless low levels of attainment by the boys, as shown in this next slide. They were weak at arithmetic. They were poor in their grammar. They had a limited understanding of the Bible. There was also an acknowledgement that once the boys had reached 10 years of age, they had to seek work as their labor began to be valuable. Significantly, girls were taught practical skills in the schools, especially sewing, alongside rudimentary reading and writing skills. As with the boys, however, many of the girls were taken out of the school as they were needed as support for younger children. Now, the main finding of the commissioners was nevertheless positive, as Price had established, quote, one of the best schools in the region, and the teachers had the ability to provide effectually for the education of their people without further assistance. Alongside this educational provision, Price embraced new scientific and technological innovations and would sponsor the British Association for the Advancement of Science and contribute to the Swansea Royal Institution and the Neath Museum. His personal social position enabled him to secure funding, as illustrated here, and the services of high-profile speakers for public lectures in Neath, such as the Astronomer Royal in 1837. Now, the benefits were twofold. First, his business was advantaged by scientific knowledge and new technology. And second, he was able to disseminate a better understanding of science and the natural world to his workforce. Now, this slide is a snapshot of the deposits to the museum in 1835 and drew on Quaker and non-Quaker support. Beyond this associational activity linked to his business interests, Price was active in those organizations which campaigned for peace and the promotion of minority rights. And this is the second theme for tonight. Now, Quakers, as is well known, had a long-standing aversion to military action, and their pacifist tendencies were certainly voiced from the mid-17th century onwards. Furthermore, the revolutionary wars of the 18th century galvanized their thoughts on such matters. At the forefront of such developments was Joseph Tregelles Price, who in May 1814 sought the general and universal preservation of peace. He is offering a moral compass for the British public. In 1814, he discussed the establishment of such a society in London, and after the end of the Napoleonic Wars, a more formal structure was put in place at a meeting of peace activists on the 14th of June 1816. And this led to the establishment of the London-based Society for the Promotion of Permanent and Universal Peace, as well as several auxiliary societies, one of which was the Swansea and Neath Auxiliary Peace Society. The original London-based group consisted of between 10 and 12 participants, including the prominent reformer and anti-slavery stalwart Thomas Clarkson. Now, Joseph Price's mother was nevertheless anxious that her son avoid the political ramification of such activity. But Joseph reassured her that he felt the subject so deeply that if brought upon a deathbed, he should not feel acquitted if he admitted to make this effort. He sought peace and was determined to provide it. Indeed, despite intense derision and vehement opposition, Price helped to produce a program that advocated arbitration to prevent war, a reduction in armaments manufacturing, and an international court for the settlement of disputes. Indeed, what he provided was a precursor to the League of Nations and the United Nations. The proceedings of the first meeting of the Swansea and Neath Auxiliary Peace Society, established in 1817, were published in 1818 in the Welsh language journal Y Serengoma. The Peace Society was a subscription-based organization which entitled members to receive pamphlets amounting to half the subscription of 5 shillings per annum. But whether it was the cost of membership or its largely Quaker orientation, it initially remained a small body of peace activists. During the 1820s, Price, continue to promote the aims of the society and encourage wider participation, ostensibly throughout Wales, but largely in South Wales. Consequently, in 1822, the Swansea and Neath Peace Society published a summary of the purposes of the society for the promotion of permanent and universal peace. So it's basically replicating the London-based organization. 5 years later, in July 1827, Price made a speech at Swansea Town Hall on the 10th anniversary of the Swansea and Neath Auxiliary Meeting, and galvanized his colleagues in their efforts to promote the society throughout Wales. By this stage, they had 40 registered subscribers and had, wait for it, had promoted over 8,500 pamphlets. 40 members, 8,500 pamphlets. Quite astonishing. Despite his best efforts, the Peace Society failed to establish any further auxiliary bodies in Wales, as far as I know, in the 1820s and 1830s. Price, nevertheless, remained true to his conscience, as is illustrated in the following report from the Cambrian newspaper in June 1831. You'll note right at the bottom of the screen that he would not make weapons of mass destruction. He would not manufacture guns in France. He remained a peace activist throughout his life. Beyond Wales, Price had also been a powerful advocate for pacifism. From 1819 onwards, he was involved in the establishment of the Society for Christian Morals, the SMC, in France. This was an organization in which he and several leading Frenchmen advocated the peaceful resolution of conflict, the abolition of slavery, and an end to capital punishment, not just in France, but throughout Europe. In 1830, the conservative Prince Polignac, a principal advisor to the despised Charles X of France, claimed that he had escaped execution because of the efforts of Price and his work with the SMC. It was argued that the SMC had been instrumental in changing the law in France for political prisoners. And this occurred just prior to Polignac's trial as a traitor. It is very lucky for Polignac that Price was there and promoting peace. Otherwise, your gentleman, your dandy gentleman on the screen would have lost his head. Throughout his campaigning, Price doggedly refused to let poor health obstruct his work. In June 1843, he was a delegate at the International Peace Convention in London. And in May 1847, he chaired a public meeting in the city, which sought to persuade the government to adopt arbitration between Britain and its potential enemies. This sentiment was echoed a year later in Neath, where he advocated petition in Parliament for the maintenance of peace, to ensure that all international disagreements might be settled by mediation or arbitration. Price continued to offer peaceful solutions to international disputes to the end of his life. He had great cause to do so, as from October 1853, Russia became increasingly embroiled in a conflict with the Ottoman Empire in their determination to get a stronger hold over the Caucasus. In March 1854, Britain and France declared war on Russia to rein back its territorial encroachments on the Black Sea, as shown in the map here, and the Crimea Peninsula. 'Twas ever thus. The war was to last until February 1856. During the escalating violence, and particularly as modern military technology was used, the conflict attracted considerable newspaper coverage, especially Russophobic attitudes. Inevitably, Price sought a long-term settlement of the area by negotiation. It must be recognized, however, that for those who worked in the armaments manufacturing, the question of whether peace or war was better posed a different challenge, one that might lead to unemployment and great financial hardship. So how was the Crimean War viewed in Wales? Price chaired a meeting of the Peace Society in Neath on the 28th of July, 1854. Here the speaker was accused of being anti-monarchical and unpatriotic. Although Price was able to restore order, the meeting was again disrupted by an impromptu band playing God Save the Queen and Royal Britannia to drown out the speakers. And allegedly, this was a German polka band, which I still find amusing several years after finding out this level of information. Undeterred, in December 1854, he delivered a speech in London in opposition to the Crimean War, but this was to be his last declaration for peace. I will now return from these international events to an earlier period in Welsh history and examine Price and his humanitarian activity, especially the championing of minority rights. In Wales from the end of the 18th century, the growing demand for a more democratic state was given expression in popular outbursts against the unrepresentative and oppressive parliamentary system. The growing solidarity of the working class via the creation of trade unions in the early decades of the 19th century was nevertheless forcibly challenged by industrialists. In 1830, at the height of unrest in South Wales, a number of these industrialists requested that troops be deployed to suppress riotous assemblies. In contrast, Price initially tried to appease his workforce by emphasizing that the joining of trade unions and potentially strike action would undermine the cordial relations that he felt existed in his ironworks. After all, he refused to employ child labor, or at least made the distinction between those under the age of 13. And as shown here, he had outlawed the pernicious use of Tommy or truck shops, these exploitative and monopolistic industrial stores that were used throughout industrial South Wales. And again, this is shown on the slide here. As such, Price was demonstrating that he had the workers' moral and social welfare at heart. Now, as you probably are aware, this was not the case everywhere, particularly in Merthyr, where in May 1831, there was a violent outburst against William Crawshay, and other industrialists who had lowered wages or were laying off the men. By the end of that month, industrial South Wales was in turmoil. The simple demands for cheese and bread and calls for better working and living conditions echoed the French revolutionaries of more than a generation earlier, and definitely echoed those who were there in the 1790s and again during the July Revolution of 1830 in France. And this absolutely terrified the authorities, both in the government and the civic leaders throughout Britain and certainly in Wales. In this context, working class in Wales led to greater anxiety among the industrialists, and relations deteriorated further when the red flag was raised in Merthyr. Now, there is no time this evening to go into the detail of the Mirth Rising, but it is sufficient to say that Richard Lewis Dick Penderyn, again, I believe that you will be familiar with this, became the target of the authorities as he was sentenced to death for allegedly wounding a soldier. Price had followed the events closely as the unrest spread across the South Wales valleys. Yet after the rioting subsided and the alleged leaders were arrested, he began to take an interest in the grievances of the rioters and to question the allegations of seditious violence leveled against the so-called ringleaders. I should perhaps point out that although Price did not condone the actions of the insurrectionists at Merthyr, he nevertheless visited Dick Penderyn in prison on the 24th of July, 1831. Persuaded of Penderyn's innocence, which has long since been corroborated, he solicited several witness statements and petitioned for clemency. Price now became the chief mediator in this case and risked his own reputation and respectability by sponsoring the cause of this notorious insurgent. This principled stand, although limited and by no means indicative of any deeper democratic impulse, was nonetheless based on an absolute commitment to the rights and liberties of the individual. On the 28th of June 1831, with 11,000 signatures, he presented a petition to the Lord Chancellor and the Home Secretary, Lord Melbourne. In a later meeting with Melbourne, Price emphasized his sense of obligation to the condemned man. I felt his blood was on my head if I did not use every exertion, and now transfer its weight from my conscience to thee, i.e. Melbourne. Despite the efforts to save Dick Penderyn's life, there was a desire to punish someone for the actions of the rioters. Price, nevertheless, continued with his campaign and was able to persuade the foreman of the grand jury at the assize court of Penderyn's innocence. Furthermore, on the 4th of August 1831, Price provided additional information that another 3 Merthyr gentlemen believed that Penderyn was not guilty of wounding the soldier, while Price also challenged the earlier witness statements. This was an indication of corrupt legal practices and the use of hearsay evidence. Significantly, Price was adamant that a reprieve would allay a feeling of irritation, restore order, and maintain tranquility. In light of this new evidence, Melbourne ordered a brief stay of execution. But on the 9th of August, he rejected a second petition, and 5 days later, on the 13th, 4 days later, on the 13th of August, Penderyn was hanged in Cardiff jail. A sad moment. Clearly, Price had attempted to bring about a peaceful resolution to this violent period, but he was unable to save Penderyn from the scaffold. These events certainly show the souring of industrial relations, the demands for basic human rights, and the appalling working and living conditions of the Welsh workforce. They further show the growing awareness of the workers that parliamentary reform was not just the means of changing a corrupt and class-ridden political system, but that the securing of democratic rights, as well as social and economic change, would need influential advocates. Certainly the efforts of Price to negotiate Penderyn's release were never forgotten. He continued to be held in esteem by the Neath workforce, even though he did not endorse the wider political changes sought by the Mirth radicals, or the later efforts of the Chartists to promote universal suffrage. He was by no means a radical spokesperson. And this can be quickly demonstrated when 50 men joined a union in September 1831. They were informed by Price that they had a stark choice: either withdraw from that union or lose their jobs. Price was nevertheless prepared to negotiate fair wages, and a later newspaper report commented on the liberality of the Neath Abbey Coal Company, who have raised the wages of the colliers. Moreover, Price was a peaceable man and believed that, quote, property has its duty as well as its rights. And it was this belief in the mutuality of rights and obligations between employers and workers that lay behind his intervention in pay disputes and in the case of Dick Penderyn. This is further illustrated in May 1833, when Price and other members of the Swansea and Neath Peace Society retrospectively discussed the events at Merthyr. They called on individuals of every class and every station in life to search for peaceable means rather than taking up arms. There is also evidence to suggest that Price may have influenced the outcome of the Chartist uprising at Newport in early 1839. And later in this, I might need your assistance. The increasingly physical means by which the Chartist movement put forward its arguments began to outweigh the moral principles advocated by others, while the travelling agents of the Peace Society were accused of being simply government spies. In the context of the Newport uprising, Price's statement in 1840 is illuminating. He commented that after attending a public meeting at Merthyr 2 months before the attack on Newport took place, he had the opportunity to discuss peace with an eminent Chartist. The question is, was this Dr. William Price of Pontypridd? Joseph Tregelles Price then offered the Society's pamphlets, the Peace Society's pamphlets, to this eminent but frustratingly unspecified man. And the Chartist agreed to read them and weigh up their arguments. Joseph Tregelles Price then observed, and it's this quotation that's on the screen, "Now that individual." Clearly, he's protecting the individual's identity, and this is not surprising as the treason trial was going on for Frost and others. Now that individual had planted 6 cannons on the side of the mountain to guard the valley in which he lived, and this is very likely to have been Dr. William Price. And that individual did meet on the night prior to the Newport insurrection with the leading Chartist. Now, the question I want to know an answer to is, who is this leading Chartist? It can't be John Frost. It can't be William Jones. It cannot be Zephaniah Williams. It cannot be Henry Vincent. So was it possibly Hugh Williams, the Chartist spokesman of Carmarthenshire, who spoke in Carmarthen, Swansea and Merthyr for the Chartists. Now, the individual and the Chartist leader differed in their views on Chartism, as illustrated here. On what point, no one knows but themselves, but they differed. So this champion, this individual who's not named, did not lead out his men, which resided in Wales, to unite with the body at Monmouth, i.e. Monmouthshire and the attack on Newport. As is well documented, Dr. Price and Chartists from nearby industrial centres, included workers from the Neath Abbey works, did not join in the march on Newport. Joseph Tregelles Price had thereby successfully persuaded his workers that, quote, however desirable every object sought by these Chartists may be, physical action was morally indefensible. The final point I wish to make this evening concerns the anti-slavery activities of Tregelles Price in Wales and elsewhere. This he did in both a private capacity among Quakers and publicly in anti-slavery meetings held in Swansea in the early 1820s. These meetings discussed slavery in the West Indies, particularly the vested interest of the Pennant family of Penrhyn. In 1821, the Cambrian printed a statement from the London Peace Society, which suggested that slavery was as pernicious and savage as war. A more formal approach was taken in the creation of the Swansea and Neath Anti-Slavery Society, which existed from 1822. In May 1823, the Cambrian reported that a meeting of abolitionists in Swansea sought the assistance of our humane fellow townsmen and neighbours in petitioning Parliament for the end of slavery in the British colonies. This, it was pointed out, had disgraced the British name and character. At the same time, the Welsh Anti-Slavery Society outlined their case in favour of emancipation and stated, as shown here, shall we, the strenuous advocates of liberty, countenance a system of the most cruel and degrading slavery in those very colonies which are dependent on us? Every principle of humanity, reason and justice forbids it. And Price certainly endorsed these sentiments. With the other members of the society, it was stressed that despite the ending of the slave trade in the British colonies, former slaves and their miserable offspring were still in a state of perpetual bondage. In July 1824, the abolitionist Thomas Clarkson, this very important central character in the abolition of slavery, visited Swansea, almost certainly at the behest of Price. And yet Clarkson's tour of Wales did not prove to be as successful as he would have hoped, as the Welsh gentry, with vested interests in colonial plantations, constituted a formidable opposition. Undaunted, Price campaigned tirelessly throughout the remainder of the 1820s and the early 1830s and even beyond for the abolition of slavery, not just in the British colonies, but also in America and by rogue merchants. He nonetheless recognized that the planters needed compensation to give, quote, their fellow men in bondage the inalienable right of freedom. Now, obviously, this concession, this level of compensation, is highly controversial today and is probably worthy of another paper. Right up to his death on the 25th of December, 1854, Price was a resolute abolitionist, attending an anti-slavery convention only a few weeks earlier. So, to briefly conclude, Joseph Tregelles Price lived a long and meaningful life, which was marked by handsome tributes in the Welsh press. He was singled out as one of the very few men who had, quote, led a long life of so much usefulness, and was recognized as a talented and benevolent man. Arguably, his passing signaled the end of a particular period where peaceful negotiation and reconciliation were the watchwords of so many of his fellow campaigners. By February 1855, the Peace Society, which he had long championed, was suffering a temporary eclipse, as the number of subscribers had dramatically fallen off. Yet his life, dedicated to improve the lot of others, had a lasting significance. His advocacy of humanitarianism and justice represented, I would argue, a legacy and an example for future generations and us to emulate. Thank you very much for listening.